2022 Fox River boat crash case that injured more than a dozen people is now in the hands of a state appeals court. Attorneys for Jason Lindemann have filed their final papers asking the Court of Appeals to throw out his convictions or order a new trial. Lindemann was sentenced to 5 months in jail, 3 years of probation, community service, and more than 11,000 hours in restitution for the collision between his power boat and the Andaluz cruise boat. His lawyers argue the state used evidence to convict him that was insufficient, and that jury selection and expert testimony were flawed. Prosecutors say the verdict should stand while a state defense lawyers group has filed a friend of the court brief supporting a new trial. A decision is expected in the coming months.